I would like to welcome you to our Defunded Schools program. I'm so glad you could come and join us. We wanted the best to talk to you and tell you what's happening with it, and we do have the best here. Our next presenter is from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Her name is Dept.
Yeah, you guys.
We'll probably do the lights off. Okay, so as Pam said, my name is Dee. I'm from the Department of Public Instruction. First, let's talk about the changing face of our school districts in Wisconsin. This map, very colorful, love it. I have a great coworker. I'm not going to take credit for this. Changes all these great colors. What you're going to see down here is the darkest color is more than 50% free and reduced price lunch. And the map shows it growing over time, over the last, this is from 2001 to 2012, which is the most accurate data. And so what you're seeing is basically we went from 21% on kids on free and reduced price lunch to 43% in 2012. Those are different kids and different challenges that are coming into our classroom. So I think that's really powerful. Now let's talk about where the students are going. If you think of this map as the green changing colors are increasing and the pink and the dark purple are decreasing, declining enrollment districts. Today, we have 75% of our students in just 30% of our schools. So that means that we have 55% of our 424 school districts across the state that have fewer than 1,000 students in them. We've got lots of declining enrollments. What you're also going to see is this matches up with the poverty pretty well. So what you're seeing is people of greater means are moving to these suburban areas and larger cities, and then out in rural Wisconsin, over here, you're seeing a dramatic increase of free and reduced price lunch, declining enrollment, lots of challenges. And that's pretty reflective of what it looks like today across the state. So now we're talking about how does poverty affect our classrooms. What this graph shows up here in this corner is the highest poverty of schools, and they all kind of fall into the lowest performing category. And as you decrease poverty, you move into the higher performing categories. There's a definite correlation that we have found looking at the data between poverty and performance. We also have a racial achievement gap. You will hear all the time that we rank highest in the nation for ACTs, and we've got a really great graduation rate, but when it comes to minority students and students of color, we have a huge achievement gap. So basically what this shows, it's very pretty again, is that if you are a student of color, if you're a black student coming from an affluent family, you have less of a chance of reaching these higher levels than you do if you are a Caucasian student coming from a low-income family. So that's pretty astounding, and we need to do something with this. And again, this is a changing face of our classrooms across the state. We have lots of different minority populations. One that's very prevalent up near Wausau is the Hmong population, and we really are trying to do our best to communicate with parents and families and help those students achieve. So basically, this will say that students of color are more likely to attend a low-performing school. It's just what the data shows. You'll see as you get down to the significantly exceeds expectations, the vast majority of those students do not meet any poverty criteria. So that's what we're dealing with in classrooms. And it's been a big change in the classrooms that we once saw 10 years ago that were mostly homogeneous. Now we're seeing, this great influx of poverty and racial disparities, and it's challenging for our teachers, and I think our administrators and our teachers are doing phenomenal things every day to help counter that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget, because that's why we're here tonight, and I'm going to talk about vouchers and charter expansion. So what kind of bothers me about my job is, like I said, I'm a legislative liaison, so I have to go talk at the Capitol about all kinds of different things. I would say I spend 90% of my time talking about 12% of the kids, the 12% of our kids in our state that attend private school. The vast majority of our kids, almost 830,000, are public school students. We also have a few over here which are still public schools. They're attending some version of a charter school. We've got virtual charter schools in our state. Also in this, 12% right here, 93,500 are private pay students. We only have 26,000 students in vouchers versus 829,320 students in public schools. Yet the vast majority of our conversations and fights over funding and testing come from a fraction of the 12%. Just to make another note here, a lot of people will say their goal is a voucher in every backpack. Well, if that's your goal, take this 93,500 times it by about 10,000, which is our avenue revenue limit, and you're at about $1 billion. So if they want to do it, there's a price tag to it. Voucher programs started out small. They've grown over time. First it started out as Milwaukee, and you see when the program first started out, it was very, very small. Here, the Supreme Court ruled that religious schools that were religious-based could participate in the program. And they ruled this because the state was actually giving the parents a voucher and they were spending it to the school. There was not a direct payment between the state and the religious institution. So the Supreme Court found it constitutional that students could use a voucher to attend a school with a religious-based education. And that's where it all kind of takes off. Created the Racine program, and 2 years later they blew the caps off that. And created the state program last year, and 2 years later they blew the caps off that. So, just looking at the enrollment, and these are voucher funded, the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, which is statewide, is about 4% of their students on vouchers. The Racine program has grown quite a bit, to about 44%. The Milwaukee program, the average is 79%. So that means you have some schools receiving, probably about well over 90% of their students on a voucher. Kind of begs the question, at what point of saturation of publicly funded voucher students are you still a private school? Just put it out there. I mean, if you are 99% voucher funded, are you a private school? So, this is what I talked about earlier. What would universal vouchers cost? 93,000 times 10,000 equals $930 million. So the current increase, where we're at now, about $77 million every year for vouchers. What school funding boils down to is a simple algebra equation. Outside of, we'll talk about this stuff later, but you have your revenue limit minus whatever you get in your state aid equals how much they levy against the property taxpayers. So this is how much you can spend minus what you get from the state is what the property taxpayers are on the hook for. Right now the revenue limit's at 0. So you can't spend any more than you could in 2010, I think. And the state aid payment goes down a little bit, so you end up with your property tax. That's what school funding is. So this graph shows the K-12 aids as a percentage of the general fund. School K-12 education is by far the largest appropriation of the budget. But what you've seen is a downward trend, pretty steadily decreasing, until this year we're at 32%. Here, you can find how revenue limits, you saw a general trajectory of them, sort of steadily increasing at a moderate rate over time. And then Governor Walker took office and we froze the revenue limits were frozen. And they brought them back up, and now they've stayed pretty much consistent across the board. The average revenue limit in the state of Wisconsin is about $10,100, $10,200. Another part of the conversation is we lost 3,000 educators during the Great Recession. Schools tightened their belts, people got let go, a lot of support staff got let go, and that's really important in the conversation that we have when we're talking about students coming to school with greater challenges outside of just the academic world. And we're losing some of the support staff that can really help those teachers and help the schools, kids and families. We have seen an increased reliance on referenda. We've seen, just in total, there was 2,800 referendums since the 1990s. They used to more traditionally be building large-scale projects, that type of thing, where you needed to bond for a new high school. That right now we're seeing a lot of them that are non-recurring or even recurring that are just to continue their operational costs. 80% of our referendums are in rural schools. This budget, proposed by Governor Walker, holds the funding flat for special education and bilingual bicultural education, so the reimbursement rates continue to fall. If this budget passes without any increase, we're going to be looking at 9 years of flat funding for students with special needs and English language learners. So that's almost a decade. The reimbursements rates have dropped 10% since 2000. We're at about 26 cents on the dollar for special education, which means that when students, if there's a high-cost student, that can draw funds just from the general pot of money. So what you see here is last year, or in the last budget cycle, they added $150 per pupil categorical. That's a little bit strange because categoricals are normally aimed at one thing like transportation or special ed, but this was a way to fund per pupil outside of the general aid formula where some schools are winners more so than other schools. This was just every student in the state gets $150, and that school is depending on it. And that got erased in the first year of the budget. So right off the bat, for every pupil in your school, you're down $150. The next year, the governor reinstates it and adds about $15 per pupil. Makes it very hard to budget when it goes up and down. They were certainly planning on that $150, and now we're having to make some very tough choices. So going back to my algebra formula, the revenue limits are 0 and 0, meaning you can't increase your spending anymore. The $150 I talked about being gone in the first year equates to a $127 million cut statewide. And then they bump it back up with $141 million, which is actually turns out to be the $165. But overall, it's a big cut in the first year. You'll hear some people say, well, we're putting money in the levy credit. Well, that's really great. But all the levy credit does is buy down the property tax value. So we really should just call it like the levy credit, not the school levy credit. So that's $105 million in the first year, and all that does is buy down the property taxpayer's share. Your school can't spend any more money, just means your property tax values. I think the memo came out yesterday, and you'll save $8 the first year and $3 the second. So they also provide some equalization aids, which just goes again to buy down the property tax level, and that's $108 million only in the second year. What we do see is a few positive things. They would say probably not much to offset the change in the $150 funding, but we see an increase in sparsity and high-cost transportation. That's primarily for rural school districts. They took Superintendent Eber's suggestion on that, and they're also helping us out with directing us how some federal money should be spent for broadband expansion. The voucher and charter expansion was included in the budget. Vouchers, they blow the cap off statewide. Charters, they expand the Independent Charter Authority Board, which is outside of your local school district board, chartering it, which we kind of most commonly think of. And that could go statewide. That's a first draw off the general aids. So for every student that would attend an independent charter school, that's $8,075 less dollars to divide up amongst all of the other regular public schools. The governor also put in some accountability measures. So he eliminated the test the kids are taking this year and changed the report cards to A, B, C, D, and F. He also created a new pathway for licensure to teachers, which essentially, it's a little confusing right now, but says you just need some relevant experience and you have to pass a test and you can be a teacher. Obviously, we're all interconnected when we talk about education. So the $300 million cut to the UW certainly affects us. We have different courses we offer with them and in conjunction, and if they're looking at cutbacks, we're probably going to feel some of that pain as well. And then the $5.4 million to the Education Communications Board. The gentleman before me mentioned public radio. Another component of that is in Wisconsin, the Education Communication Board provides specific digital learning materials like videos and programs that are just based on Wisconsin. They include tribal education, Wisconsin government, things like that we can't get from anybody else because they produce them specifically for our students and for us to use across the state. So I would leave you guys with that little smiling face because otherwise it would have just been a really depressing end.